Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our last webinar for the year. This is the Data Science for Society webinar series or seminar series we've been running for now. I think this is 4th or 5th year. We typically bring in a number of speakers to touch on topics at the intersection of data science, AI, and the way that it impacts us in different ways. Sometimes it's very technical, like, from a computing or mathematical side. Some it's a society side, and sometimes in between, which I think today's one is really going to touch on. Thanks for joining us, for those who are coming back and have been coming over the last couple of months. We look forward to a different type of cadence in the next year. We will update everybody at the beginning of next year. We're also very thankful this year that we were able to partner with a number of people. I want to acknowledge the University of Pretoria Library, and then also alumni from our programs and different types of people who are working in the background to get this going. I'm very excited today as we have Leonida Mutuku, who's going to be speaking. I will just read her bio, and then she will take over from here. And then about after 30 or 40 minutes, we will then do Q&A. So Leonida is an entrepreneur and researcher working at the intersection of inclusive AI and development. She's an experienced data scientist with numerous peer-reviewed publications focused on the opportunities of data, AI, and emerging technologies. She has led groundbreaking research on data stewardship, open data, big data, and AI in development. Her work was among the earliest to document the impacts of open data in sub-Saharan Africa. Leonida, sorry, I think I will do that. And that maybe might tell me I have to resolve something else. Okay. For now. Okay, Leonida has developed an AI early warning system that supports thousands of smallholder farmers across Kenya to adapt to climate change and mitigate losses from crop failure. She's also developed a framework for community engagement on data and AI, and her research is informing the implementation of participatory digital governments in Kenya through the Open Government Partnership and drafting of Kenya's AI strategy. She regularly leverages expertise and platforms to ensure African experiences, contexts, and voices are represented in the global discourse on data. She holds a BSc in Actuarial Science from University of Nairobi, Masters in Business Analytics and Big Data from IE Business School in Madrid. And for me and a couple of people who work with us, Leo has, that's what I think her name to us, has really been one of the voices across the continent to really bring the very multi-stakeholder transdisciplinary way of thinking about AI development, and her insights in different spaces is really something I personally respect. So I look forward to this talk. So yeah, Leo, I will hand over to you and you will take this over.
No, thank you, Vukosi, so much for that introduction. I'll just take a moment to share my screen, and we can get started right away. So just confirm when you can see it. Yeah.
Good to go.
Great. So as Vukosi mentioned, I am an AI practitioner based in Nairobi, Kenya. But as part of my work at the local Development Research Institute, we support African countries in their efforts to end extreme poverty, hunger, and inequality. And I lead the AI practice there. So Vukosi has mentioned a lot of the work I'm doing, but I just wanted to take this opportunity, and especially in today's talk, to introduce the partners who have made the work that I'm going to share with you possible. So Vukosi and I have been supporting the Lacuna Fund, and Vukosi sits on the steering committee, but Lacuna Fund has actually funded this toolkit that I'll be talking about later today in the webinar, as well as
Leonida. Yes. There's a comment that your microphone, I don't know if you have multiple microphones, that it might be a bit lower.
Okay, just give me let me know if you can hear me better now.
Okay.
Can you hear me better now?
For me, it's about the same. I don't know if from anybody in the chat. Okay, like for me, it's clear. I was just checking if it was maybe too low for other people. Okay, maybe yeah, it's clear. You can go ahead. I'm sorry, Terry. Hopefully maybe on your side, you can increase the volume. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, maybe Leo, you can go ahead. Terry, if there is a thing, I'll try to fix it also in the recording. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Leo. Now we can't hear you. Okay, now go ahead.
How about now?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so just a bit of background about this work. It was really inspired by a problem that Lacuna Fund was facing. So the fund itself was established in 2020 with the aim of supporting, the creation and expansion and maintenance of labeled AI training datasets that are really relevant to global South contexts. And of course, as the grantees started preparing to publish their data sets, what Lacuna Fund realized was that there was a challenge. So it's one thing to fund the creation of data sets. It's another thing to ensure that once they're published, there is greater awareness about these data sets and that they will actually be utilized by the wider machine learning community that they aimed to support. So having noted this, there are a couple of things that we work together to try and solve. The first one being, how do we establish common standards and protocols for publishing training data sets so that we ensure that they are findable and interoperable with other data sets that have been produced by the community. The second thing we wanted to achieve was establish a standard approach to presentation of data, metadata methodologies, tools around the creation of the data sets so that other researchers understand their features or limitations and can contribute to the data sets on an ongoing basis. And the final thing was really trying to find how do we create a systematic way of community engagement so that you just don't publish data, it dies with us in a repository, but we inspire and promote its usage and maintenance along the way. So then the basic question is, so once you have AI training data sets, you've worked hard on a project to curate them, to produce them, then what? So that really, we tried to articulate what we could do. And it culminated in what we are calling a sustainability toolkit of machine learning data sets. And I'll walk you through how we conceptualized and published the toolkit. So the toolkit itself is step-by-step playbook that provides guidance and checklists that researchers can reference as they're preparing to publish their data sets, or even if they already have published data sets, they can use it to ensure widespread use within the machine learning community. Of course, it was designed with Lacuna Fund grantees in mind, but we collectively agreed that it has a widespread usage beyond just like this small cohort of researchers, but to all of us who are, actively contributing and participating and building models in the AI space in our context. So before we go too deep into this talk, I just wanted to acknowledge that, my experience is very specific to curating training data sets for language models and computer vision models in the agriculture space. But I assume that all of you are experts in your own domain. So the way we structured the toolkit was in the form of strategies, so that they stimulate reflections on your end on how to ensure that should you decide to publish AI training data sets, that they will have that intended impact and high utility to your fellow community of machine learning researchers. So this toolkit is specifically useful if in the course of your project you intend to publish publicly. But for many research groups that share within, their departments, there are pointers that can help other researchers in your department utilize the data sets effectively. So I think the best place to begin then is to first understand what sustainability is, and I've put on the screen the full description of how we envision it. Sustainable AI training data sets, and we highlight the word high quality curated data sets that are created with long-term accessibility. So not just, a one-off thing where you put up and next year no one will find it. They have broad usability in mind, and they represent, they prioritize the societal benefits, respect, and are, diverse in terms of if it's especially representing a community, they're reflected well in the data set, and that there is awareness of the context. So for us, it's a full scope approach. And it means that, as Wukosi said, as an interdisciplinary researcher, we tend to also sometimes be activists for specific practices for data. So by publishing sustainable training data sets, then researchers, of course, will ensure that the expected benefits to society, and especially in our low resource context, are maintained even after the end of open data or open source AI initiatives, which this toolkit is designed to support. So for us, we based our approach on the FAIR data principles, and I'm sure some of you, if not all, have come across this, but these were really one of the most widely acceptable approaches to ensuring data is shareable. And also that's why we based our toolkit on it. And the FAIR principles stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and were mainly envisioned for research objects to ensure that the research objects themselves and data are reusable, will indeed be reused, and are as valuable as possible. So a lot of, like, when you look at the FAIR principles, how it's structured, they tend to speak mostly to metadata, but we transposed some of that thinking to broader machine learning training data sets and even the resulting models. And so for them, something like findable would mean like the data is assigned a global, unique, and persistent identifier. But for us, even just where the data itself is stored, ensuring it's easily discoverable as well. So for FAIR, accessible would mean that the data itself is retrievable using this identifier. But for us, it's also thinking through the format that the data is presented in. Is it easy to download, use, and reuse? Interoperability, while they talk about accessibility in terms of, an applicable language for representation. So in specific domains, there's different ontologies used. For us, interoperability goes beyond just the language, the ontologies, the variables themselves, to ensuring that the data set can be easily combined with other data sets that are produced, because ultimately we do want this to be a community resource. And finally, reusability, going beyond the FAIR principles, understanding of rich descriptions and metadata with clear, accessible data usage licenses. But for us, it's also just in terms of the content of the data, what is the level of utility? And then, of course, it's licensing and how it can further be reshared across the ecosystem. So we structure our toolkit just in a very simple format. Sorry, the first one being what you need to do before you publish the toolkit, the data set, and the second one is a checklist once the data is published. So when I was starting my career in data science, and I think many of you probably have the same experience, there's these two data sets we're always referring to. They are on Kaggle, and they're used to train, basics of machine learning, specifically classification and regression. And I'm here referring to the Titanic dataset and the IRIS dataset. So I know a bunch of you have probably used those datasets to death, and you can relate. And there's a reason why they are still go-to training datasets for machine learning models. However limited their utility actually is to society. So this toolkit is really to help you and other researchers create the same kind of value and long-term benefits and utility for whatever training datasets you're working with and you'd like to publish. So I'll briefly go through the dataset, the toolkit itself. We built it featuring examples from agriculture, climate, natural language processing, health, and energy domains. But I think the basic principles are applicable beyond those. And this was primarily because this is the focus currently of Lacuna Fund. So a couple of things to think about before you publish your data set. Of course, the first thing is to ensure that it's high quality. That we can't underscore that more. And this is because ultimately that's where people drop off in terms of usage of your data if it's not good quality. And quality, of course, we're looking at formats, how you've cleaned your data and validated it, as well as how it tests with various models. So when we think about publishing formats, I think this varies from domain to domain. Here I'll give the example of health. This tends to be multi-dimensional data. So think about MRIs or X-ray data sets. So they tend to include 2D and 3D images, time series data. So in the case of dynamic imaging, and could be multi-parametric data. So, different body measurements that accompany those MRIs or X-rays. In the context I work in, which is climate and agriculture, data sets tend to be from satellite images, from sensors, from ground truth data. And so they have temporal and spatial dimensions. And of course, requires to use common ontologies for weather. Think about Celsius versus Fahrenheit, what agriculture specific terminologies, ecology. And so there's a requirement for semantic alignment that you don't just use Kelvin, for instance, when all other data sets being used in your domain are in Celsius. So, and that's a very basic example. So that's one thing about, producing high quality data sets. The other thing is that for usage, because your data set doesn't represent a full, complete picture, then it has to be interoperable. And so things such as standard terminology, the data variables themselves, how they're named, really enable people from different institutions access it. And then going back to healthcare, the most effective clinical data standards seem to be, the most effective data sets that meet clinical data standards determine, semantic interoperability and if it can be used beyond where it was produced. So for this work, we did reference a number of research papers, and one of them really provides metrics for remediation quality strategies. I can't remember its full name. I think it's called Data Homogeneity, Quality and Remediation, but it's referenced in the toolkit, and if you're interested in reading more about that. So the final part about this is documentation. Of course, you have to ensure for people to trust your data set, they understand its provenance, like how did you collect it, like what methodology did you use, is it like a secondary data set or you actually went to the field in the case of ground truthing, what are the annotation guidelines you used if your data set is labeled, and other pre-processing steps, especially the ones related to production of high quality data. And then because we do encourage you publish your data together with test models. And that's one of the best ways to ensure that it is a good data set, is that you have to also publish the model documentation, the code and dependencies, and that then makes it a really good way for people to engage with their data and understand it better. And finally, also inspire different use cases from that data set. So the other thing that you need to consider before publishing the data set, of course, is from a data ethics perspective and for integrity, you have to preserve the privacy of human subjects who have contributed to the production of that data. So in our toolkit, we share different anonymization techniques you can consider, such as removing personally identifying information, which includes replacing maybe with pseudonyms or manual and automated reduction. Something that we do with satellite imagery, which is differential privacy, like, creating just some noise so that people can't specifically identify, let's say, where a farm is. And then in other cases, such as in healthcare, the introduction of synthetic data. So in some cases, we think it's important to establish codes of conduct and publish them together with your data set, because it enables other researchers really to understand what approach you took, and hopefully can emulate that when they are building on top of your data set and want to, whatever the use cases that emanate from that, really meet that code of conduct. So in the next slide, I just show you a brief, snapshot of how then we structure this information in the toolkit. So this is an earlier version of it, but we are continuously supporting it. So it's very interactive in terms of examples. You can, toggle between them and just dig deeper. So this really is how we have structured the toolkit. It's on Git. It's on GitHub, so it's very easy to contribute to it if you have other ideas that you think we should consider. So then we get to the important part, that you are putting your data and you're publishing it now for the general machine learning community to adopt. So here, Lacuna Fund actually has some specific hosting guidelines that they encourage their grantees to use, but I wanted to maybe highlight something that's important. So the first of it is finding an appropriate hosting platform. If any of you work in academia or some research institution, then there might be some specific requirements you're bound by to publish your data. But if you actually want to have widespread reuse and visibility, maybe like the Google Drive for your institution, or that repository, that the open access repository they have may not be the best place, because how many people browsing will find that specific site or that Google Drive and engage with the data. It also is very cumbersome to deal with that, to version. So thinking of platforms such as Harvard Dataverse, GitHub, Zenodo, those Kaggle, those widely referenced platforms, gives you an edge and provides more visibility to the data. And then a lot of these drives that we have and repositories do not have versioning. So if you update your data set, other researchers won't know the changes that you made to it. And so there becomes confusion, or all those changes are lost in the process. So beyond that, of course, it's really important to think about how you license the data, because then that limits the level of access other researchers have. Lacuna Fund tends to, recommend CC by attribution, by SA, and by 4.0, among other considerations. But again, you have to license your data so that you clearly spell out how people will engage with it. Otherwise, there might not be other opportunities for remediation for you in case of misuse. And then some of these data sets we work with are extremely large. And I mean, thinking about environmental sustainability and even just how other researchers engage with you, you probably want to compress your data before you publish it so that it's into other systems. So here I'll also show just another snapshot of how, some of these hosting guidelines look like. Yeah, it's pretty much what I have talked about. So we get now to this part of, okay, so now you've built quality data sets, you've, published them in a very, easily findable, accessible place, you've licensed them, then what? So I think sometimes we think it's just about the technical aspects of it, but it's really important to consider, like building engagement with your data set. So there is work after the work, and we often leave that out for a number of reasons. So the first one on sharing data sets, it's important to actively engage your community, because that's the only way that they get to know and be aware that the data set is there. So this could be in the form of blogs, academic papers about the data set. I think a number of you already do this, but if not, I think you should, especially if you're gearing towards the academic community to really utilize your data set. Conferences, competitions, and hackathons really are a nice way to build this ecosystem where stakeholders, developers, end users, researchers, even subject matter experts can engage with your data. Again, the toolkit has a number of different detailed suggestions about how to go about this, but I'll skip over that. Even as you share your data set, I think it's really important to be intentional about building a community for it. There was a reason why you wanted to publish it. Maybe you wanted engagement with this data set. But community here, I look at it in three ways. The first one is stakeholders. In different domains, like for instance, where I work in agriculture, stakeholders here could be the farmers who provided us with their farm data. It could be, patients participating in a clinical trial, or other stakeholders who actually did contribute to your data set, and they enable you to understand their perspectives better and concerns, and whether they are well represented in the data set. So I think it's important to continuously engage with them, especially if you're building models focused on society. The other community, of course, is of like-minded researchers like yourself. It could be in the form of conferences, online fora. I think through that sustained engagement, you get to know best practices. You get to also promote your data set, find collaborators to really either grow it, find additional support for it, and sustain it over time. And then a third one is this interdisciplinary community of practice. So this could be domain experts. So for instance, NLP researchers, at what point do you engage linguists, or, governments players who might want to adopt your AI solutions or utilize your training data set. So building that kind of community can also help ensure sustainability of your data sets, because they tend to also be the ones with who can define the problems that create those use cases that enable your data set to continually be used, or the resulting machine learning models are useful for their contexts. So I think the final strategy that we look at, although ideally it doesn't mean that it's the least important, is ensuring that you bear in mind like the ethical, basic ethical considerations, which include respect for things such as copyrights and intellectual property when using or sharing data. So you might not be the originator of the data, but before you publish it, like, did you respect copyright or IP laws? Because if you didn't, there's the likelihood of your data being brought down. Ensuring that data subjects, where you are, you have data about human beings, are aware about how their data will be used. Actually, I don't like the word data subjects, but this is now in a technical manner. But you got informed consent from them, especially for sensitive data. You have to have ethical guidelines that typically determine how you use and collect that data. So some of these guidelines are provided by the government. On the slides I share, for instance, getting the IRB clearance, Data Protection Act provisions, but also internally, you could set up your own ethical guidelines for how you build and deploy machine learning models. And just like peer-reviewed journals, papers, having an ethics review process is really helpful because they also tend to look at other issues that are represented in the next point, such as fairness and bias. So this, I always say that it's helpful to have a peer review committee for your training data sets, for your AI models as well, because that's how you end up catching like some of those biases that you might, as a researcher, might not pick directly. And ensure that also, again, if your data set speaks about specific socio-demographic factors, that they are respectful of cultural norms and not amplifying any society biases. And it's also at that point really important to regularly monitor and assess how the data sets are being used. So when you publish on some of those repositories that do have those guidelines, those provisions inbuilt, then it's very easy to know whether your data set is being downloaded and used for good or for bad. And you can update the accompanying policies. One thing I think we forget to think about is, yes, we want to make the machine learning models and the training data sets like as efficient as possible for a use case. But if you do want other people to use it, we have to be, resource efficient. So all those hacks that you came up with for ensuring that it's really easy to load your data set, to run the model, or maybe you've made it a smaller model than it was before, it's helpful to publish that so that other researchers can pick up on it and not just, dump data set without intention and hope that people will use it. So that way we collectively, are also considerate of other, environmental constraints and other constraints that we have because we are, in this African context where access to GPUs, etc., is not that easy. And that way also the models that you build are sustainable and scalable. And so the final bit of it really for us is the money bit. So most of the projects we work on, and I think a lot of AI projects for research on the continent tend to be grant funded. So they really have a short window that you can, resource them. But once the grant is over, then they tend to fall off the sidelines. Yet the use case itself could be very useful for society. So then what the toolkit enables you to do is also consider then if you want to continue sustaining, let's say, a project that does continually produce AI training data sets, then you have to be considerate of cost centers such as human resources, how you sustain all these different engagement strategies we're sharing, travel to different places to promote the data or to conferences, and even just the hosting of the data sets themselves and compute for testing models. So, I mean, we are not too creative with this and are always looking for additional, ideas around this. But of course, finding a second grant, a third grant from various government bodies, private foundations, even your own education institution might be one way to think about it. Very successful strategies tend to be from building partnerships with academia, with nonprofits, and other organizations that will actually utilize that data set beyond your intended use case. So they can provide, whether it's in-kind support in the form of expertise or contribute monetary support to expand the data set to meet their use cases. And if you build the community that I was suggesting earlier well, then they actually could, be involved and they create ownership in your project and can help you fundraise for it or even donate to it as needed. So I think those were covered the major parts of the toolkit. It's a work in progress. It's a living document. As I mentioned, it's structured. It's hosted on GitHub. And so after this, I'll share the link for anyone who wants to, use it and contribute to it. So sometimes, when we talk about these things, we tend to I've lost. Yes, here we go. We tend to, talk about it in abstract, but I just wanted to share some use cases from the Lacuna Fund grantee community. So this is one of my favorite AI training data sets. I think it's still growing, but Kenkopas was from one of the earliest cohorts of Lacuna Fund, and they basically put together, NLP data on Harvard Dataverse, one of the repositories we suggest. And as you can take your own time to explore this. But for us, why we like referencing this is because they meet a lot of what the toolkit suggests. The data is extensively documented. And as you can see, there's a description here that goes on for a while. It's well referenced. It has a license. There's metadata to it. There are versions to it. So there is it meets a lot of various criteria, but it's also been published in different data journals on other repositories like LANAfrica, and they do a lot of work to increase the visibility of this data set. So many of you probably have already heard of it before today. Then there's and they have a test model published on Archive. Another use case is eyes on the ground image data, which is hosted, I think, on ML Hub. The name might have changed of late, but here you can see that it's the data itself is structured in a stack format, which is a special temporal asset catalog format, which we do promote for these kinds of data sets that have both ground truth and satellite imagery. But even if you dig deeper, you'll see that the data sets are well formatted, well labeled, and they are also promoted through competitions. So this is also another widely used data set, and we also reference it in our own work. Yeah. So I had another use case, but today it wasn't opening, so I'll skip it and can share that later. So thank you so much for listening. And I have seen there are a bunch of comments that have come, so I'll look at that.
Thanks so much, Leonida, for that presentation. I think it's supremely important. Sorry about that. On my side, just check. I think while people get ready to just ask questions for everybody, you can just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and then I'll acknowledge you, and then you can unmute. In that case, but I'll kick off. I think one, thinking about this, and in this case, yes, I'm playing a bit of insider football, being on the steerco of Lacuna Fund, and the discussions we've had in thinking about how we go forward in having visibility, having provenance, having long-term planning about this data being available. But I wanted to touch, maybe ask a questions about, especially for a lot of these types of work that are going on, they're not necessarily working in the perspective of large organizations or maybe academia, that there might be a lot of support to assist in this, in putting these things together. There's a lot, especially given maybe where the Lacuna Fund is coming from, or a lot of the spaces that I think a lot of people are joining here, where it's community driven. Any thoughts that you can, or more suggestions on how to deal with preparing, like for you, maybe it's like, just painting, hey, these are the things that you can think about. But maybe for somebody else, it might be overwhelming. And maybe I'm asking on, if there were priorities, even though you're not supposed to say, this is the thing that you should take care of, what would you suggest? And then maybe the second one is also to deal with the parts of the more ethics parts in terms of the data. Because again, I think when you get into the community side, it's a bit more different than, again, in a university, we might be under our review boards. In large organizations, they might look at it from risk and compliance, but then communities might have different challenges in thinking about these things well. So yeah, so for me, those were the first two. For people on the Zoom, if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat if you don't want to bring it out by asking a question yourself, or if you want to ask a question, please just raise your hand. Yeah, so I'll start there, Leo.
Okay, so I think the first one, in terms of what is important, of course, personally, I think everything here is important, but it ultimately depends on the end goal of the data. So the way this toolkit is structured assumes that you want to publish for the community then to utilize your data. So the issue around quality, just basic cleaning, validation, checking for outliers, you can do that, I think, with or without a lot of resources, especially if you are the one who has curated the data set. And then labeling it, there are various just standard naming conventions, right? So if the data is of high quality, then the next thing that you'd want to do is just make sure that it's anonymized, and that then you finally publish it on one of these platforms. So I think all the platforms I have shared are very easy to sign up to and upload, but they are a good starting point for you to engage with the community. Now, from beyond that, from a strategy perspective, I think a lot of communities are self-organized, right? They could be online.
We'll be licking his lips now, knowing that he'll probably get a.
Sorry, they are probably organized on Discord or Slack. I think, just using those available channels is a good starting point. But always finding opportunities in your town, in your city, to showcase this, so you don't have to go to some fancy conference away. I think there are a lot of emerging tech communities that want to be inspired by the work you're doing. So I think that's a less of a heavy lift than, following probably all the steps, but I think they meet the general spirit of what the toolkit is trying to espouse. In terms of ethical guidelines, I always say that first and foremost, if nothing else, meet the bare minimum that the law requires. So don't get yourself out of favor with the law just because of how you that you're in a small organization. I think there's the Data Protection Act. in our country, in Kenya, and in many countries across Africa, has a lot of provisions about how to deal with data sets. There are emerging community efforts. We are working ourselves on a community charter that can be used by SME players to espouse specific ethical and considerations for their data set. Going back to privacy, informed consent, I think those are pretty easy things to implement. But you might not be able to do a full model audit and for different risks. So here is where you can acknowledge in the documentation of your data set, like the limitations to it. I am of the opinion that all data sets are biased. So it's always just good to acknowledge the bias of the data set and then use your channels to seek help to make it more representative, for instance. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you on that. A question that comes up from Terry Wanderi. In your experience, what industry fields seem like they would have stable structured data set until you started working in them and sampling their data?
So this is probably from a private sector practice. I think when you think of the financial industry, you just assume because it's a lot of transaction-driven data that they have the best databases that you can, build models on. But actually, the amount of pre-processing and pre-work that you have to do on those data sets is quite a lot because of either legacy systems, closed systems, just disjointed factors. So that has always been a very difficult area for us, even if a lot of that data is inherently structured in tabular format. So yeah, that has been my experience, the fintech banking sector. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? As again, you can raise your hand and then I'll just acknowledge you, then you can unmute.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a question, I would also just be curious to know from my understanding, like what you're working on. So a quick comment on the chat is also helpful. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think the other piece maybe now that comes to mind is the discussions, I think, over the last half a year and then likely going to go over in the next probably 12 to 18 months. I'm sorry, I'm not a futurist. I hate doing this, but on the side of the modeling and the compute for that, any thoughts, especially when it comes to that intersection with data? I think you tried to give an example of people planning beyond the data being available, but then trying to find second, third kind of sources of funding to now continue developing the work, where it might be model building, making the model also available, and then on top of that, any other future maintenance that has to happen in those spaces, but then maybe going a little bit deeper there.
Mm-hmm. I think for us, we have seen that community organization will really help us build a stronger body to advocate for or to access these resources. So in the work I'm doing right now, we are building a community of practice, and in that community of practice is where you start sharing, those common problems, common issues that you're facing across the board, and start finding common solutions. So, for instance, things around compute, what we are trying to do. I can't say I have the answer. In fact, Vukosi, you might be able to answer yourself better. It's like if we pull together resources from a community, it might be easier for you to let's say aggregate funds to get shareable data center, something small, but and that's helpful if you're not in a large institution that is already planning for these things, or find some grant funding, as a collective as opposed to as individual researchers. So I would say community organization for me is what might be helpful to really start solving or address some of these resource constraints we have in our space. Yeah.
Cool. Sorry. Okay, another question from Terry. Is there a technopolis in Africa that is able to support local ML, machine learning, and knowledge intelligence workers through subsidized computing or well-developed open science tools? You can start first and try, and then I can also try.
I was about to say, I think you're better placed to answer this, but I wanted to say that I think there are some universities like in Kenya, DECUT is opening up their doors for people to really tap into their resources. There are upcoming initiatives that the government is thinking about, but I personally work in, AI4D, which is like this collective of researchers that's supported by IDRC and a number of other researchers, but it doesn't necessarily answer your question, and Vukosi has actually better ideas and is working on some of these things. Yeah, so maybe you can pick it up.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's one that's like at the moment there's no direct answer, but there are lots of pieces of things that are starting to shape up, Terry, and I think for everybody here. The reason where like this is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the discussion is that the what has happened over, if we look at the last maybe 5 years or so, and I'm sorry, like hopefully it doesn't come together as being arrogant. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of other people who've been doing lots of work for years to bring this up, but there's been an acceleration of a lot of communities, and communities here is in a broad sense. It doesn't mean like a community in a village or something like that, but people coming together and identifying that they can build data, make data available, and then that also drives innovation in different ways. Just the same way as you make models available, and that also has a way of driving innovation. But now, the challenge that a lot of people in the global majority are seeing is that making data available is not enough. On one side, because it doesn't mean that your use case necessarily is going to be taken care of. It might be good, people might show new benchmarks and all those things, but it doesn't necessarily finish that innovation curve in some ways. The other side is there also tends to be a bigger rewards for model building than for data. It's an unfortunate thing. I think I will also link, I think there's I don't know if it's an ACM thing, like a article about ImageNet, and like obviously knowing also ImageNet had a lot of controversy, not just about like people at the beginning didn't really think it would do anything, which is the tone of the article, but later on thinking about the bias and some of the other things that came in. But the article is worthwhile in understanding this challenge of saying you're doing data work sometimes is seen as, no, it's not useful, but it keeps on being repeated over and over again that for the science, the modeling, data needs to be better and better and better. So people trying to say, hey, as we provide data, we also want to share in the recognition of the things that are built. So some parts of it is making sure that locally more and more modeling is done on the continent. And as such, the work that is happening at DECUT, with Shira, AI4D network, just also for Clarity, we're also part at DS4Society, the AI4D network. We host the Natural Language Processing Lab under that banner. And there's more and more of the work that we're doing to try and figure out this computing thing, and not just for ourselves. I know, like personally, a couple of years ago, before we got into the kind of the generative AI space, we used to find ways to make, like we get grants from different big tech companies to use their compute, and you would just try to find a way that when you know you're not using it, can you then make access available to other people? But the levels of compute that are now needed are so much more bigger that we're trying to think about, literally continental scale changes so that researchers as yourselves and developers who are on this webinar can get access. So please, I think on one part, my call is do make the noise, do ask around in your side, and also do be generous, right? In that if you identify something and you think it's worth sharing with other people, do so. Reach out to people like myself. I will spread it as much as possible. But it's going to be a major thing in terms of even getting to things like sovereignty, where people feel that they can build systems, they can adjust them. The reason that you do versioning is that you learn something new and then you need to adjust again, right? Given those things, those should be things that really are localized as much as possible, because you can spot more of the challenges than somebody who's not really in your context in these spaces. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other? Okay, I think you've answered one. I will try and find that paper. And yes, we are in the search at the moment for some postdocs. So if you're interested, I put in a link earlier in the chat. That's more looking at large language model evaluations for African context and African languages. And there will probably be another one, I'm hoping, that will go out sometime in December, also looking at that ecosystem analysis for language across the African continent, learning from the past in those spaces. Any other questions? We've got 4 minutes, and I'm a person who really likes, so I will, in that minute, while maybe somebody else comes on, let me look for this paper. Oh,
Hi,
Amy.
hi there. Sorry, I just can't. I'm actually on my phone because of life. So sorry about that. I can't find a way to raise my hand, but doing it like this. So, hi everyone. My name is Amy Shelver. I've joined from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, and from within an innovation and analytics hub that has just been set up for the last 6 months. And we're looking really deeply into AI and human rights issues. So we're looking for partners and people to walk along the journey with us. But I think our main challenges, I'm South African as well, and I've been following this journey for a while. And thank you, it was such an interesting talk. We've got a bunch of data scientists in our unit, but we're looking at expanding partnerships and working closely with people. Especially data scientists, data engineers, data specialists, to help us build some of the innovations that we're going to put out. Some of them are as basic as AI assistants, and others are a little bit more advanced and sophisticated, and ingesting large amounts of treaty information, press release information, decisions from the Human Rights Council. So I'm just flagging that as a possibility here, because we're also interested in mass translation of all of these key documents, building smaller models that can actually facilitate a human rights lens and ontology, and apply human rights definitions, and help ultimately businesses, countries, policymakers, and communities make better human rights decisions, or make better decisions through a human rights lens. I'm just putting that out there as an opportunity. I'll drop my email in the chat, and if anyone wants to just reach out and initiate a call, we're very excited and open. And because of my South African roots, I'm rooting for African data scientists who often see things very differently to the data scientists we're likely to get from elsewhere. So yeah, that's my spiel. Thank you very much again. Very interesting and a little less technical. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Yes, Abby, I think you'll probably be the last question.
Yeah, I think my question is just basically on how do we be able to look at this data set that is being placed out there in terms of their usage, and again, probably just try to, maybe as part of what you are going to add or to extend the tool, is to be able to add a way in which we can monitor the trend in terms of the usage of the data set. And because that will also help the creator of the data set in terms of the citations and all that. So I don't know, maybe that's one of the things that you're looking forward to put in as part of your future work in the creation of this or correction of this data set? Because that will also help, and we can also probably look at the demographic in terms of how is it being used to impact the society itself and other. Thank you.
Thanks. So maybe just a quick comment to Amy. You might potentially consider working with Zindi, especially if some of these projects can be put out in the form of competitions. They tend to have a large community of African data scientists who are on the platform, so it would be a nice place to source. And then to answer you, Abby, so some of the repositories that we suggest that you publish your data sets do help you track the number of downloads over time. Something Vukosi has mentioned, and I think as science communities we can push, is for better documentation because they do have the capacity to do this, of who is actually accessing the data set, like potentially requiring some form of registration where these demographics are captured. And that way you also get to understand whether, you're just building, for instance, just for big tech or also, for other fellow African researchers. So that's more of an advocacy thing that we can do collectively to ensure that these platforms show better analytics of usage to researchers. But maybe, I know we are 1 minute over. The last thing will be, we suggest in our toolkit that you should leave your contact details as part of the documentation for your data set, primarily because when people have problems or have utilized the data, sometimes they do want to engage with the authors, and that's also a direct